The famous football coach Vince Lombardi used to always start his season by getting back to basics. So he would gather his team and he would say, he would hold the football up, he says, "This is a football." This is a violin. This is my personal favorite violin. But before I get to this, let me tell you about the history of the violin. It descended from a series of bowed instruments that were considered, well, let's just say déclassé. There were instruments that were cultured, refined, sophisticated. And then there were these bowed instruments. And what's the difference? A plucked instrument is one that you pluck. A bowed instrument is one you play with a bow. There was an Arabian instrument called the rabab that had 2 strings and was played upright. And if we had my PowerPoint presentation, I would have a picture of this and show somebody playing it. In Europe, there was a descendant of this called the rebec, where they added a string. It was very kind of oblong. They played it under the, not under the neck, but kind of like this. And again, it was often played by street musicians, gypsies, riffraff. The kind of people you wouldn't want to associate with. There was another series of stringed bowed instruments that started to become a little refined, and these were called the viols. And I have a wonderful picture of a viol, if you can just imagine what it is. Now the viols were very fat instruments that had a sloping, not a sloping shoulder. So if you look here, this is called the shoulder, and you notice that it comes straight into the neck at a roughly perpendicular level. A viol comes up like this. And they are tuned in fourths, whereas a violin is tuned in fifths. There was only one surviving member of the viol family which is currently in existence, and that is the bass viol, or bass fiddle. The next time that you're at a concert, look at the bass viols, and you will see that their shoulders come up like this, and not like the cellos, the violins, and the violas that come in like this. They were tuned in fourths, and believe it or not, they had frets that were made of catgut that went across the fingerboard. Now, some brilliant sadist at one point decided to take the frets off this instrument, thereby provoking decades and centuries of horrible out-of-tune playing on the part of violinists foisting their music upon unsuspecting ears. When I was a boy, I used to stay up late practicing, and my sister has not forgiven me to this day. Now the violin, as it exists today, has its origins kind of in antiquity, but the best anyone can tell, the earliest instruments that are known, was from a gentleman by the name of Andrea Amati in the late 1500s, who was commissioned to build some instruments that would be suitable for the sophisticated oral palates of the court. And so he came up pretty much with the design of the modern violin as we know it today. That was in 1570. He spawned a whole series of a dynasty in Cremona, Italy, of violin makers. And this was one of the most famous shops. And if you were anybody, then you got a violin from the Amati family. They had an apprentice who worked there in the 1600s in the 1600s, named Antonio Stradivari, who some of you might have heard of through his instruments called Stradivariuses. And in fact, if I had my wonderful PowerPoint presentation, I would have one of the finest examples of a Stradivarius instrument. So the modern violin is pretty much the same. And what's interesting is that it is both a work of craft, it is a musical instrument, and it is a work of art. And he was an absolute genius who came up with this. Let me talk about the way that this is constructed. If you notice, the back and the sides and the neck are all made of maple. And this is a particular type of maple called curly maple, is sometimes called, or sometimes fiddleback maple, precisely because it's often used to make the back of fiddles. This particular one is very common, a very common design. What they do is they take a block of wood, block of maple, they cut it in half, and then they glue it back together, and then create the sides. So it's exactly symmetrical. If you take a look, and there's a little seam running down the side. If you look at it sideways, you will see that there is an arch to it. So unlike a guitar, what they do is they take a thick block of wood and they carve it out so that it is this arched shape. And the top is arched as well. The top, however, is not made out of maple. The hardwood is made out of a much softer wood, typically spruce, as in this case. And they try to get the grains so that they're very fine and even. This particular one is also a two-sided top, just as the back. Sometimes they're made of one side, one block, that is, they don't cut it. And again, if you look at the arch of the top, you will get a sense of how this is made. They don't bend it. They basically take a big block of wood and they kind of carve it out. The sides, which are curved, they do take a straight little strips of wood, and they heat them, and they bend them around a little mold to form it in this shape. Now, the scroll is purely ornamental. And in fact, there are many German scrolls that have like a little lion's head or the face of a man with a beard. I don't know if you've ever seen those. And they get very fancy. The fingerboard is made of ebony, typically, or at least with a good one, as it is here. The fittings, which are the chin rest, the tailpiece, and the tuning pegs, are made of various materials. And these days, what material it's made out of partly is an indication of the quality of the violin. So in this particular case, these are all rosewood with ivory inlays here. Nowadays, I hope they don't use ivory, but I bought this 36 years ago before that was such an issue. Plus, it's just a little tiny. The finest instruments that are made today are typically fitted out with boxwood pegs and tailpiece and chin rest, with a little ebony nib on the end, just for a little class. The final element that gives the violin its distinctive sound, and something that people have been trying for centuries to figure out, is the varnish. The varnish is put on in many, many different layers. And in fact, you can see here that as you play it, the acid from the sweat of your body wears away the finish. So here somebody played it for quite some time and wore away the top layers of the brown varnish, leaving the yellow varnish, which was a lower layer there. So part of what gives the violins their wonderful depth are these layers of varnish. And it's just really wonderful. You can't really see this, but under the chin rest, it's also worn away, which shows that somebody played this for some time without using a chin rest. These chin rests are actually a very recent development. The strings were originally made from the intestines of a sheep, which were called catgut, and which took away a joke that I used to like to say when I would say I switched to steel strings because I felt sorry for the cat. So now I have to say I felt sorry for the sheep, but then go and explain that catgut is really from the guts of sheep. The final element is the bow. And the bow is made from Pernambuco wood. So between the ebony and the Pernambuco, this is a veritable holocaust of the rainforest. So every time you see a violinist, just think of the horrible things that are happening to the rainforest. However, there is a renewable resource which is strung on the bow, and that is horsehair. So imagine the sound that you get when you drag the back end of a horse over the entrails of a cat. So fellow Toastmasters, this